Twofold Poverty: The Idealist versus the Realist by Landon Shelley and McNiff.
We were challenged with the question, how should we define and measure poverty in the USA today? So we are going to tackle that question in the next 7 to 10 minutes. But let us just give you our central argument so you have an idea. And notice, this is a two-part question. We have to define and then measure poverty, so we have a two-part answer. Poverty, in descriptive terms, is defined as lacking barriers to freedom to make choices about basic human functions due to economic barriers. Poverty should be measured in terms that are easy and efficient and lend themselves to effectively tracking trends. First, we are going to tackle how to define poverty. This is the descriptive form of poverty. Many believe that poverty is based on income and that you can draw a poverty line, but that is just not the case. Income varies greatly, not only domestically but globally. How can you compare someone living in poverty in the United States and someone living in poverty in India based on income? Also, two people may have the same income but have different poverty statuses. For example, one person could have a genetic thyroid disorder and super expensive medical bills. Due to this financial burden, they can't afford warm winter clothes. Both these people have the same income but different poverty statuses. We need to dig deeper. What does poverty look like? Well, I'd say an impoverished person lacks clean water or nutritional food. Someone without sufficient shelter, particularly in the colder months. Someone who can't pay their medical bills. Someone with inadequate clothing. So these are all qualities of poverty, and these are all cases in which someone is being deprived of basic human rights. We can say that someone is in poverty if there is an acknowledgement of these deprivations and a lack of basic human rights. In essence, poverty is a violation of human dignity. But what does it even mean to be human? That's a tough question. What are the qualities of humanity? These are tough, but the key questions in determining someone's poverty status. According to philosophers Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, the best way to judge if a person's humanity is being violated is to assess their functionings and then corresponding capabilities. Alright, what the heck is a functioning? A functioning is the elementary foundation of humanity. Wow. Something is human because it possesses functionings. The two types of functionings are beings and doings. For an example, being well-nourished, being well-educated, being in a shelter, again, basic human rights. Then doings, such as practicing a religion, participating in political life, having work or a job. All things that make humans, humans. So, if someone possesses all these basic functionings, their humanity is not being violated and they're not in poverty, right? Wrong. Here's why. Let's say there are two people, person A and person B. Imagine, person A wants to walk the Appalachian Trail, so they just leave their job for weeks with that and this poses no financial threat, and for weeks they sleep on the ground under the trees. Meanwhile, person B loses their minimum wage job and can't make rent, so they have nowhere to live. So person B sleeps on the ground under the trees. Both person A and person B have the same functioning. Both of them sleep on the ground under the trees. But we can agree only person B is in poverty. So back to the question, how do we define poverty? The key difference in these two previous situations is that person A and person B have different capabilities. Person A is capable of determining where and how they will sleep at night, while person B does not have that capability. Poverty can be defined by a person's capability to choose their functionings and between their functionings. To quote Amartya Sen, poverty is not a matter of low well-being, but the inability to pursue well-being precisely because of economic means. In Martha Nussbaum's study of poverty, she was able to identify central capabilities that were relevant. These include life, just being able to live, bodily health, having good nutrition or shelter, bodily integrity, having mobility or security, senses, imagination, and thought, having complex thought processes that set humans apart, emotions, having a range of emotions and being able to act on them, and then play, enjoying and entertaining oneself for pleasure. Here's another commonly used example to demonstrate capabilities. Again, we have person A and person B. Person A has 3 children, one with a major health complication. So for the last week of a month, the only food person A has a day is a glass of orange juice. So she can take the leftover money and feed the rest of her family. Person B decides she wants to lose weight. So the last week of the month, the only food she has a day is a glass of orange juice. Again, person A and person B have the same functioning. They both only have a glass of orange juice a day for a week. However, person B has the capability to choose what she has, while person A does not have that capability. In fact, person A has to choose between two basic human functionings: medical care for her child and nutritious food for herself. This tragic choice is a hallmark of life in poverty. So I just walked you through our logic of how we define poverty, in descriptive terms relating to the essence of what makes humans humans, and their functionings and capabilities. Poverty is lacking the freedom to make choices about basic human functionings due to economic barriers.
While Sen and Nussbaum's capabilities approach to poverty works well when it comes to defining poverty, it leaves us with a problem. It is not easily and practically measurable. It is hard to quantitatively measure someone's functionings and corresponding capabilities. How is one to quantitatively measure some of Nussbaum's central capabilities, such as senses, imagination, and thought, or bodily integrity? It would require someone to individually look at all of the central capabilities and individually look at different people's situations. This is extremely time-consuming and virtually impossible. Therefore, we must turn to a more practical method of measuring poverty: the official poverty measure and supplemental poverty measure. The main purpose of the OPM is to set a threshold and measure whether or not people fall above or below the threshold. The OPM sets the threshold by first starting with the USDA's cheapest food plan in the early 60s, and then adjusts it for inflation using the Consumer Price Index, multiplies it by 3, and finally adjusts it for family size and the number of children. The OPM measures resources in terms of income. Therefore, if a person's income is less than the threshold, they are considered to be in poverty. If a person's income is greater than the threshold, they are considered not to be in poverty. With the OPM, income is considered cash or anything cash-like a family has before taxes. Cash-like resources include paychecks, Social Security, royalty payments, veterans payments, unemployment checks, earned income tax credit, and anything else that can be converted to cash. The OPM is an absolute measure, meaning that it measures a person's income compared to what is needed to be bought, rather than measuring a person's income compared to other people's income. The OPM is based on the census, in that the threshold is set for what the census calls a household. A household is a family related by birth, marriage, or legal adoption. Similar to the OPM, the SPM also sets a threshold and measures whether or not people fall above or below the threshold. However, the SPM sets the threshold in a different way. The SPM uses surveys of all households based on geographic location, on their use of what are considered basic necessities: food, clothes, shelter, and utilities, often abbreviated FCSU. The SPM then uses the 33rd percentile from the surveys and adds a small amount for miscellaneous expenses, such as household and cleaning supplies and non-work transportation. The SPM measures resources in terms of income and expenses, rather than just income like the OPM. Therefore, the SPM counts all cash-like and non-cash-like resources. Non-cash-like resources include governmental assistance, such as food stamps and rentals assistance, and also deducts for taxes, medical expenses, child support, and work-related transportation. The SPM is a quasi-relative measure, meaning that it measures a person's income based on the other people's basic expenses, but not based on people's luxury expenses. Although the SPM is a complete measure of poverty, it only acts to supplement the OPM. Poverty should be measured in terms that are easy and efficient and lend themselves to effectively tracking trends. With over 50 years of data, scholars can easily identify the patterns and track the trends of poverty over time. The OPM has stood the test of time in large part due to its simplicity. In its handbook, Poverty in America, John Iceland says, the main advantage of absolute poverty measures is that they are conceptually easy to understand and intuitively appealing. Another advantage of the OPM is its absolute nature. Poverty should be measured on the amount of basic resources a person needs to survive, not the amount of resources a person needs to be like their peers. Poverty is defined as lacking the freedom to make choices about basic human functions due to their economic barriers. Therefore, in order to measure poverty, there is no need to compare the freedoms or resources of different people. A person or household either has the freedoms to make choices about basic human functions or they don't. Iceland puts it well when he says scientific reasoning, not value judgment, should drive the changing notions of who is poor. Probably the biggest disadvantage of the OPM is that only cash-like resources count for income. The OPM does not take into consideration non-cash-like when calculating a household's income. Because the OPM does not take food stamps and other governmental aid into consideration, the government is unable to measure how effective their aid programs are on the level of poverty. The OPM also does not take into consideration work-related transportation and child costs or medical out-of-pocket expenses. In many families, such costs are necessary to hold a job and earn income. Meyer and Wallace wrote that in 2016, 12.3% of all persons living in the United States were poor by the official poverty measure. They went on to say that if we were to use a more comprehensive measure of resources, including the cash value of food stamps and the EITC, and subtracting an estimate of payroll, state, and federal income taxes paid, 11.4% of all persons would be below the poverty threshold. Many of the disadvantages of the OPM are accounted for in the SPM, and therefore become advantages of the SPM. The SPM includes non-cash-like assistance, which allows the government to analyze how their aid programs are working. The SPM also includes work-related transportation and child care costs, medical out-of-pocket expenses, and takes into account the rising standards of living across different geographical locations. Although the SPM fixes many of the disadvantages of the OPM, it creates new disadvantages that the OPM did not have. The SPM is much more complex and harder to use, as it factors in a much wider range of things into its calculations. The SPM is also a quasi-relative measure in that it partially compares people's resources to other people's resources. As stated earlier, poverty should be measured based on what people need to survive, not how they compare to others. In terms of switching to the SPM, it would be difficult to make such a drastic change as scholars would not have any previous data to make predictions about the future with. Poverty should be measured in terms that are easy and efficient and lend themselves to effectively tracking trends.